Hi everyone, and welcome back to our symposium. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. And my name is Miley Arvin. I am co-director of Pacific Island Studies at the University of Utah. And I'm speaking to you from my home in Salt Lake City. For those of you who may be only listening instead of viewing the screen, I am a light-skinned Native Hawaiian woman with dark hair in my 30s. And my Zoom background image shows an aerial photo of the Salt Lake Valley with some buildings of the University of Utah campus visible in the foreground and the Wasatch Mountains in the background. We also have our border of a red Pacifica pattern block U logo that represents our Pacific Island Studies program here at the university. So this image of the beautiful land here reminds me to begin by sharing the Indigenous land acknowledgement that was written for the University of Utah. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So I hope our words here today, though focused on Pacific Islanders, remain in good relation with the Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, and Goshute peoples. Thank you to Dean Catherine Stockton for her support, as well as our funders, the Mellon Foundation, and the University of Utah's Global Learning Across the Disciplines grant from the Office of Global Engagement. This series, Pedagogies for Indigeneity and Diaspora, Pacific Studies at Home and Abroad, brings together a number of teachers, activists, and community leaders to talk about what it means to teach Pacific Studies in the current moment. In the pandemic-fueled shift to online teaching and conferencing, what are the pedagogies, both old and new, that Pacific Islander scholars, activists, teachers, and performers are drawing on to educate and foster knowledge relevant to Pacific Islander people? This panel is the last panel of our symposium. Throughout the symposium, we have taken special inspiration from the work of the late scholar and poet Tarawa. Her work, which so creatively transgressed disciplinary boundaries, continues to offer a vibrant model of teaching Pacific studies at home and abroad. The title of the panel today, Decolonization of Specific Bodies, like the titles of all the panels in the symposium, are quotes from her work. Within the broad topic of Pacific Island Studies, Pedagogies for Indigeneity and Diaspora, this panel focuses specifically on issues of health. So the structure for the panel will be, our moderator will introduce the panelists, and then each of them will have about 10 minutes to present and discuss their work. Then there'll be some time for panelists to dialogue before opening up to questions from the audience. Please feel free to add questions to the Q&A box during the event. It's at the bottom of most Zoom screens on the Zoom menu. And we'll select as many as we can within the allotted time for the panelists to answer after their presentations and dialogue. Also, please note that we have live captioning available during this event. To enable it on most Zoom platforms, you can look for the CC or closed captioning button on the menu of the meeting controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and just click on that button to view the captions. Some viewers may also need to select Show Subtitle after clicking the CC button. In the chat, our team will be sharing some more links now to some related Pacific Islander programs and opportunities, and I'll say a bit more about all of those at the end of the panel. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator for today's panel, Jake Fitisemanu Jr. Jake was born in Wellington, New Zealand, to Karen Dang of Kaimuki, Oahu, Hawaii, and Jacob Fitisemanu Sr. of Falefa, Upolos, in Samoa. Jake was raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, and Taylorsville, Utah, with a love of his vibrant Samoan, Chinese, and Korean heritage. He graduated with honors in social science from Westminster College, where he also obtained a master's degree in public health. Jake co-founded the Utah Pacific Islander Health Coalition and has chaired the annual statewide Pacific Islander Health Week since 2012. He was appointed to the U.S. Census National Advisory Council in 2014 and serves on the board of directors of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum and the Mana Academy Charter School. Earlier this year, Jake was appointed by President this is maybe a very outdated bio, but at one point, Jake was appointed by President Barack Obama to the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Jake is the outreach coordinator for the Utah Department of Health, Office of Health Disparities, and lives in West Valley City with his wife, Lucia, and their 2 daughters, Moana and Lanu'olu. And yeah, I know this bio is outdated because I think there's many other roles and titles that could be added onto your bio, Jake. So sorry we have an outdated one, but please feel free to share more. And I'll just turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maile. That introduction was more than adequate. It's not about me today. I'm just thrilled with the panelists and the presenters that we have with us this afternoon. Good afternoon to all. I greet you and all of our ancestors from here at the Valley of the Great Salt Lake in the shadow of the Wasatch and Ochre Mountains, which retain the names given by the Ute and Goshute peoples. I'll give our captioner a little heart attack here by just greeting you in Samoan. Fa'afetai te lelava mo le avanoa, o te fa'atalo fatu ma lauava ma lau fa'alualu te lelava. Very, very grateful that you're all tuning in today. We have an amazing panel planned for you today. And before introducing our distinguished panelists, I do want to thank the University of Utah Pacific Island Studies Initiative for hosting this symposium, for creating such a dynamic space for sharing knowledge and hopeful dialogue in the midst of a global pandemic. In the next 90 minutes, you'll be blessed to hear from 3 incredibly renowned health advocates and educators who will briefly present on their topic through their own perspective lens. And as Maile mentioned, we'll roll out the mats and have a little deeper conversation and time for questions. I'm fangirling right now a little bit because our panelists are dear mentors. They're renowned heroes of mine, and I'm sure for many of you out there as well. And so feel free to pose questions, enter them there in the chat as well. We hope to be able to get to as many of them as we can. So hold on to your seats, restrain your excitement as I introduce our 3 presenters for today. Our first presenter will be Dr. Juliann Anesi, who grew up in the village of Wailoa in Samoa before moving to Tonga territory in the Los Angeles Basin. Currently, she's a storyteller and assistant professor of gender studies at UCLA. Her passion for storytelling really complements her research interests in disability studies, inclusive education, decolonial feminisms, and social movements in Samoa, and more broadly, Oceania. And Juliann is currently at work on a book manuscript called Tautua, or Women's Activism and Disability Advocacy in Samoa. Talofa lava, Juliann. Our next presenter, our second presenter, will be Dr. Vili Nosa, Associate Professor and Head of the Pacific Health Section at the University of Auckland. Dr. Nosa has a Bachelor of Arts in Education and Sociology, a Master of Arts with honors in Sociology, and a PhD in Behavioral Science. Associate Professor Nosa was born in Niue and raised in Grey Lynn, Central Auckland, and Mangere East in South Auckland, New Zealand, and holds the distinction of being the first Niuean to have graduated with a PhD. His scholarly interests are in Pacific health issues with research specialization in addiction and substance abuse. Whakalofa atu Vili. Our final presenter today will be Josie Howard, who is the program director for the nonprofit community advocacy organization known as We Are Oceania, or WOW, W-A-O. Josie is a native of Onoun Island in Micronesia, a graduate of Xavier High School and the Community College of Micronesia, where she studied before transferring to the University of Hawaii at Hilo, where she studied biology, anthropology, and Pacific Island studies. That transfer was in 1989, making her one of the first Micronesians to migrate to the US under the Compact of Free Association Treaty. Josie is also a co-founder of the Micronesian Health Advisory Council, the Micronesian Cultural Awareness Project. And on top of all this amazing work that she does, she also earned her master's in social work and now is able to apply her expertise as a coordinator and facilitator at Epic Ohana Incorporated and as a social worker at St. Elizabeth Episcopal Church. Rananim, Josie. Thank you all for being with us today. We're going to jump right into it because we've got so much great content for you all to unload on us here. And I know a lot of great dialogue is here to come. So at this point, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Dr. Juliann Anesi.
Yeah. Lava Jake, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I just want to first give a shout out to our organizers, Professors Maile, Hoku, Kehao, Angela, for organizing this panel and also the whole symposium. And also I just want to recognize our graduate students too, who are also part of this labor. So thank you all so much. So a little bit about myself. I am 5'7" tall. I'm not going to tell you my weight, but I'm thin enough, I think. I've got black curly hair, brown skin complexion. I'm wearing a teal colored shirt, and my background is actually where I am Skyping in or Zooming in from today, and that's Tonga land of the Gabrielino Tonga peoples in Los Angeles. So I am going to turn over to sharing my PowerPoint slide here and we'll get going. So can you all see that? All right.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, so decolonizing specific bodies is our panel, and one of the real exciting things here is I love thinking about Teresia Teaiwa's work here and the play on words, right? So we're not just talking about the specific body as in SPECIFC, but we're talking about specific body, right? SPACIFIC. So hopefully you got that part. So super exciting. And I want to start here with a quote of this word, which I think specific body is something that I'm really excited about because I talk about disabled bodies, I talk about ableism, and I also talk about cultural understandings of these concepts. And so I want to start here with Teresia's quote. And in her article, Bikinis and Other Specific Notions, she suggests that the name bikini, spelled B-I-K-I-N-I, evokes memories and visions of a specific historical and contemporary political reality. And specifically here, Teresia's nodding to nuclear testing in the Bikini Atolls as just one, she says, of an albeit of precarious one of the many colonial phenomenon and process that affect the Pacific region. So I'm only going to start off with this quote to kind of kick us off with how we're thinking here about the body, you know, and along this way, and how do we sort of think intersectionally, not just about the specific body, but also other aspects of the social and physical environment. So I'll briefly read here this quote for those who are listening. And Teresia says, the specific body, which is S-Pacific, PACIFIC body, emerges for me as a site for comprehending specific social and physical environments and for apprehending generic effects of neocolonialism on all islanders, and are committed to political and cultural cooperation at the regional level, end quote. So I want to start with this quote because I think part of my work in thinking about pedagogies and teaching during COVID is also about the personal and the political. You know, this kind of duality in our teaching in Pacific studies, but also as Pacific people. So this is just my modest contribution here, kind of thinking about teaching, you know, at the duality of these aspects of the professional, but also the personal. So in the same piece, Teresia talks about decolonizing of the specific bodies in intimately woven ways, woven into island women's activism. So this is sort of where my work sort of springboards out of in thinking about women's social movements in the Pacific. And also footnoted in this quote, Teresia talks about earlier island women's work like Laura Souders in Guam, and also Hanani Gay Trust work in Hawaii as examples, right, of this women's activism here. So now turning to kind of my own work around women's activism or disability activism, I start here with this picture of several women who were the co-founders of two schools in Samoa, one called Ongawhima Malama, and the other one called Loto Tobafai. And these two schools were created in the mid-1970s and early 1980s. And they were precisely created because disabled students, specifically those with physical intellectual disabilities, were not admitted into formal schools. So this picture here is of 7 women. They're standing together as a group. Above their head is a sign that reads IHC Ongawhima Western Samoa, and it's a blue sign with white font. So this is also for me kind of an unknown history. My auntie here, who's pictured here on the right side, she's got a black blouse on and a white skirt. My auntie Stella on my father's side was also a co-founder of these schools. So much of my work here thinks about what can disability activism teach us about inclusion, collective care, and self-determination. So I'm really interested in these kind of relationships and how they sort of bring forth change, not only within our own communities, but also in our own cultural practices. So I specifically kind of focus on Tautua, as Jake read my bio on this book that I'm working on. And this right here is a mural of a very famous Samoan proverb. It's called Oleala Ilipule Ole Tautua, which means that the road to leadership is through service. And just to back up a little bit and describe a little bit of this mural, was created by J.P. Pereira. I think some of you may remember that his brother Len was on a panel yesterday. And so this mural is on the side of a gas station in Long Beach, California. And just to describe the photo, it is a young woman sitting cross-legged, and she is wringing out ava, which is a liquid, AVA, and it's into a kava bowl, and that's spelled K-A-V-A, liquid, and she's in a taupo. She would be considered a taupo, T-A-U-P-O-U. And this is usually sort of happens in a formal Samoan ceremony or sort of a closing of the ceremony. And so I don't know if you can see a little bit, but this phrasing or Samoan proverb is also to the right-hand side translated to Spanish. So that was something that was really interesting that JP also added on to this mural. So along these lines, I really want to just think about the question of what does it mean to tautua those not held in high positions or high regard to the community, right? So when we think about disabled people, how do we kind of think about tautua, which means service to your family, to your church, to your village, and what happens when we sort of push those boundaries and extend those boundaries to also tautua those who are not often regarded in those positions. So to turn to the personal end, I just Teresia's work and personally has also inspired me to kind of learn more about my Kiribati side, which is on my maternal side. So I grew up in Samoa knowing my grandmother is Kiribati, but not fully understanding these dynamics. So my generation of cousins, we are kind of actively reconnecting these branches. And so to just talk a little bit about these pictures, this is kind of our homework reveal here. So I'm going to pretend if Tercia was here, she would in the audience physically. This is kind of our homework that I've been doing around sort of recovering and making connections for this side of my family. So this is what we found so far. So yeah, Tercia, yeah. Ono sai mai se whaafola tule le tala matua inga So let me go through these pictures and who these fabulous people are. So on your left side is my maternal grandmother, and her name is Kaimoa Tibau. And then to the middle, and she is it's a black and white photo, but she is a woman sitting down with about shoulder length hair. She is looking straight into the camera, and she's got a dress on. And then in the middle here is another picture of 3 women and a little girl. So the woman in this pastel dress, sorry, that's my timer. So the woman here on, sorry about that. The woman here, I'm timing myself out here. The woman here in the middle is my cousin Julie, and then my auntie Ruth. And then this is my cousin Ainga. So this is my maternal grandmother, and this is my mother. And then this is the latest that we connection that we had in 2019. And this is George, who is my nephew, who connected with our family there in Kiribati in 2019. And so coincidentally, George is also one of Terry's former students at Vic. So yeah, so this is sort of looping back, I think, to the question of pedagogies and teaching Pacific studies at the moment. I also just want to throw in here that, Yuki Kihara's work, also sort of talks about this, that the Pacific has always been diasporic, right? So meaning that our connections to each other, which, is something that the last panelist talked about, are not new. And so all these connections with the ocean, the waka, and whatnot are all sort of starting points where we can think about themes of, queering, but also, in disability studies, we say cripping, these aspects of our identity, of our practice, and our knowledge production. So I think finally, I'm going to wrap it up here at the structural level. What I really want to highlight here is that the environmental pollution, militarism, and colonialism equally creates disability, mental illness, and chronic conditions and diseases, which very much affects our communities. And I think we have to destigmatize the shame attached to them and to tell our stories. So here I'm hoping that we embrace kind of our stories, our own histories, arts, culture, and music here in ways to teach us about the past and the future. So on that note, I'm gonna stop there. Faafetai lava.
Thank you so very much. I think one of the things that I really love about indigenizing and bringing our flair to academic conferences and academic settings is the way that we are able to make it relatable in terms of ainga, in terms of family, emotion, connections, and not just the hard facts and data and empirical nerdy stuff. So I love that introduction. Thank you very much, Juliann, for setting the tone for the rest of our hour that we've got here. Our next presenter, will turn the microphone over to Dr. Vili Nosa.
Okay. Whalawalayatu, my name is Vili. I'm Niuean. I'm one of those migrant children that migrated to New Zealand with my parents in the late 70s. So a lot of my upbringing and education has been in New Zealand, but I do spend quite a bit of time in the Pacific region. And I do a lot of work up in Niue as well. As Jake said, I want to acknowledge the organizers, Maile, Angela, also your introduction, Jake, and also to the other speakers today. So that's a bit of brief background of myself. A lot of my work is mainly focused on health at the moment, but I have a social science background in terms of the work that I do. So as you can see from my title of my presentation, I put it up as the land of milk and honey in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's looking at indigeneity, Pacific, traditional culture concepts for health promotion messages. So one of the things that I've been trying to look at in terms of using our traditional culture concepts as a form of health promotion and improving our health profile for our Pacific people living in New Zealand, but also in the Pacific region. So next slide, please. In this presentation, I want to give a brief background on Pacific health in the Pacific region. So I'll talk about some of the key issues, some of the Pacific health challenges that we have. Then I want to highlight some of the Pacific health issues in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and identifying what are some of these key issues that impact our Pacific people when we migrate and we settle in this land of milk and honey. And then I want to talk about two important things, which I'd like to present. It's a culture concept as a form of health promotion. But I want to also specifically look at our brother and sister relationship amongst our Pacific communities and also our culture. And then I want to end this presentation with a way forward, and I want to pose a question in terms of, will this actually work and how would it improve our Pacific profile for our Pacific communities? Next slide, please. So in the Pacific region, obviously it's a big, vast region that we do have in many Pacific countries in Polynesia, Micronesia, and also Melanesia. And I want to highlight in this particular slide some of the key issues that we have in terms of the Pacific region. So in the region, as you know, we live off the land. We grow our crops with our taros, cassavas, bananas, and yams. So we grow a lot of our products in the region. We also do a lot of fishing and hunting as a form of collecting food. And also providing for our families. So one of the things that we have in the past is that we traditionally grow a lot of our crops. We live off the land. We eat the crops that we grow in terms of on the land. But it's also one of the key issues that I've seen and a lot of the work that I do is there's a lot of importation of unhealthy products that are not good for us. And it's actually impacting and affecting our health in the region. So I'll give you an example. What we're importing into the region is mainly mutton flaps and turkey tails. These are sort of the two common discussion points that we have amongst my colleagues and also many of my colleagues in the region is they're importing a lot of unhealthy products into our Pacific countries. We also have food security issues, different types of foods that we have in terms of our crops that we grow in terms of Pacific island nations. There are different crops and different agriculture products. Another key issue I want to highlight in this particular slide is climate change. We all know about climate change, big issue in our region. It impacts mainly Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Tokelau, many of the low-lying countries. So in terms of this climate change issues, we have changing disease patterns, food security issues that we do have. We're not able to grow a lot of our crops because of the land, because of the sea impacting the land. There's also loss of land where a lot of our crops are not able to be grown on this particular land, change in marine environment, and also we have a lot of climate disasters in many of our Pacific countries. Next slide, please. This particular slide gives you a bit of an idea of some of the issues that we have. And as I said previously, mutton flaps, as you can see from this particular slide in Tonga, it's classified as it's not a good product for us to have in this particular region. We have high rates of diabetes. Our life expectancy is falling because of some of these cheap, fatty kind of meat, which is mainly imported from New Zealand. So we're actually importing a lot of these unhealthy, products that are not good for us in terms of importing in these countries. Next slide, please. So a quick snapshot, some of the key Pacific health challenges that we have in the Pacific region, non-communicable diseases. This is one of our biggest killers that we have in the Pacific region. It's a big issue for us in many of our Pacific countries. It's probably the number one disease that we have in many of our Pacific countries. We also have infectious diseases. This impacts many of our Pacific countries. We've had this for many centuries and in many countries. Maternal and child health are often a big issue in many of our Pacific countries, where access to services, resources are quite limited. Adolescent health is another key issue for many of our young people. It's often impacted in terms of their mental health and some of their social issues they do have. Also want to highlight injury. We have a lot of injuries in the Pacific region, mainly around accidents, in terms of issues that we have for many of these Pacific countries. And then I want to highlight mental health. We all know about mental health issues. That's a real big impact in many of our Pacific countries throughout the region. So it is an important factor in terms of some of these cases. So just, as I said, this particular slide gives you some idea of some of the Pacific health challenges that we have. And I just kept it quite short in terms of this particular presentation, but these are some of the key issues that we do have in the Pacific region. Next slide, please. So I've given you a bit of snapshot about the Pacific region, some of the key issues in terms of the health profile, and some of the key issues around food security, some of our diseases. Now I want to look at New Zealand. So we're moving to New Zealand, we're migrated here. So as you can see from this particular slide, our Pacific population makes up 8% of the total New Zealand population. Samoan population is one of our biggest populations that we have here. Then we have the Cook Island Māori, which is 21%, Tonga 20%, and Niue, which is where I'm from, we only represent 8% of the population. So as you can see, population numbers are quite big in terms of Samoa, Tonga, Cook Island, and also Niue. Most Pacific people live in the North Island, such as Auckland, in terms of migrating and settling. So a lot of our Pacific people tend to migrate on the North Island and tend to settle in Auckland, because that's where a lot of our Pacific families are settled, and a lot of our families, come and stay with many of our relatives. And I know many of our Pacific people do that. It's a form of moving to a country, you settle with your families, and you make a new lifestyle for work, education, and a better lifestyle. Next slide, please. So this particular slide, it gives you a bit of a snapshot. We've settled in this country, but we've also encountered many health issues that we do have. So as you can see from here, Pacific people die younger. We have high rates of chronic diseases. Our respiratory diseases are quite high in terms of COPD, pulmonary diseases, asthma, bronchiolitis. Hospital admissions are very high, which is linked to deprivation status. Cancer, lung cancer and primary liver cancer, again highlighting that some of the issues are quite high. Cardiovascular diseases, mortality rates, and diabetes. Diabetes is one of our biggest issues we have here in New Zealand in terms of Pacific people. Access to healthcare is a problem, late presentation, late diagnosis, smoking, and differences in cancer rates. So these are some of the key issues that I just want to give you a bit of a snapshot in terms of our Pacific health profile here in New Zealand. Next slide, please. So what I've done here is I'm going to present you a key concept. It's not new to many of our Pacific colleagues and our communities. I want to use a form of culture concept as a form of health promotion. So the key concept that I want to highlight here is the use of our brother-sister relationship and using it as a form of positive health messages. So in many of our Pacific cultures, we have a common element, our brother and sister relationship amongst our Pacific communities. And I want to see if actually, in terms of this brother and sister relationship, is it going to make an impact or influence in terms of improving our health profile? Next slide, please. As you can see here from here, I want to highlight some key issues around, and I'm only going to look at the 4 key Pacific groups here in New Zealand, which is Tonga, Samoa, Cook Island, Niue. So in the Tongan culture, we have the whahu, which is the father's oldest sister, the highest level of respect in formal occasions. She is the family matriarch and never sees her siblings and nieces and nephews. So the whahu, it has, this sort of relationship in form of leadership in terms of the family and in terms of their status. In the Samoan culture, we have the whianganga. There's a specific code and etiquette, and I know some of my Samoan colleagues can maybe expand on this and ask me some of the questions that I may miss here. So here the brother is responsible for his sister's safety and general welfare. So they're responsible for looking after their sister. Next slide, please. In the Cook Island culture, we have the tungane toina special brother and sister relationship. So this is, again, it gives you a concept in terms of the brother protecting the sister and protecting their younger family members. In the Niue culture, we have the umotua, which is the role of the brother to look after the sisters and also the unmarried sisters and children. Next slide, please. So in this particular example, I want to give you, one of the studies that a good colleague of mine, Dr. Tuila Purcell, and a few other of my colleagues, they did a study around Pacific people's violence and the power of control wheel. So in this study, they used the brother-sister covenant as a form of protective and preventive factors against sexual health for each particular culture. So the brother and sister, it's a significant relationship. It's seen as protecting the sister when there's issues around sexual issues amongst the sisters. Next slide, please. So it also extends to the, to the extended family, close cousins, relatives, children of the family. So there is a brother-sister protective relation between, the male and female, the brother and sister, looking after the sister. Tongan views as this the anga whakatonga. It's also that relationship looking after, again, the sister. There's also the respect notion in the Tongan culture, looking after your sister. And then lastly, a sister outranks the brother. So there again, it offers that leadership in terms of protecting and looking at our Tongan culture. Next slide, please. This slide here is one of my master students, Tongan student. She looked at she completed her master's in public health, which looking at smoking amongst Pacific Northern in the Auckland region. And what we wanted to explore here is looking at the term of whahu and how it was used as a form of leadership and providing support in terms of smoking. So it was a thesis. She did 20 interviews of Tongan women. As you can see, for some of the results we found, it was stressful leaving, friendship, rites of passage, smoking is bad for you. There's also issues around accessing smoking cessation services. They felt it should have been in the community, not so much going into the clinics, so they needed to bring it into community. So one of the things, the key recommendations that we found that the brother and sister relationship can be utilized to support smoking cessation, where they have the leadership and power to say no smoking or banning smoking in terms of many of their cultural and family functions. Next slide, please. So in ending my presentation, I want to pose these two questions. How my work engage with South Pacific Island diaspora and indigeneity. So the 2 points I want to highlight here, the practice of the brother and sister relationship, it can be used as a form of promoting positive health promotion messages. And this is a way that we need to sort of look at it as an example of what can we use in terms of our culture, in terms of our tradition, and how we can use it as to improve our health profile. So my last point here, and I want to put this as imposing out to the audience, will using our traditional culture content make a difference to improve our poor health disparities here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? So this is a question I want to leave here in terms of my presentation, and I hope it gives you an idea of some of the work that I'm doing here in New Zealand, but also in the region. And my last slide, please. This is my homeland in Niue. This is where my village is in Amasele. And this is the only beach that we have in Niue. And this is where I was born and migrated. As I said, I'm a migrant living here in New Zealand, but I have some strong ties up in Niue. So whakaoelai for listening to my presentation, and I hope it gives you an idea of the work that I do, and just to pose some questions around and using our traditional cultural practices. So thank you.
Hello, Vili. Thank you for that amazing visual, as well as the knowledge that you've dropped on us today. It's fantastic. In public health promotion, it's quite common to strategize around intergenerational communication, but intra-generational dynamics, at least to my knowledge, isn't as widespread a topic. And so I'm really looking forward to learning more about this brother-sister relationship dynamic that you are studying and putting out as a strategy for health engagement. That's fantastic. Thank you again. At this time, really excited to invite Josie Howard to the floor to share with us. And we'll go ahead and turn the mic over to you, Josie.
Thank you very much, Jake, for the introduction. And I want to acknowledge the organization for this conference and my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Wow. From Samoa to New Zealand, I'm going to take you to Micronesia. And with that, I will start with a chant that goes like this. E sabolo bone wata e sabotapwe no ya e sabolo bone wata e sabotapwe no ya to na e pwe we I sareke ne wata to na e pwe we I sareke ne wata e malu te ku sapono matawe ya serak watale matawe lupo e sabuato weo e aeo e kongus. Woo! Hi. So we have arrived in Micronesia on my small island of Onon. When I was invited to speak at this conference, I'm going, okay, I'm not an academia. What can I contribute? But the invitation reminded me a lot about the course and a group that I was very privileged to be with at UH Manoa when I was doing my master's. And it's called Representing Oceania. It was there that I realized that in a college, gaining a master's level degree, that I can actually be free to share my knowledge, who I am, with my class. And I feel like this space is providing that to me today. And so I am going to talk from a very organic and perspective of a Chugis woman, who is from also the outer island. So this is where I come from. Before I start, though, I want to acknowledge because my topic will be talking more about what health means to us as Micronesians and as Chugis. And I do have a cousin who's like a sister in our culture. There's no word for cousins. There's no word for uncles. There's no word for aunties. It's all mama, papa, or pipi, and mongie. So I have a sister on here who's organizing this talk today, and that's Dr. Angela Robinson. I am so proud of her. She was my baby sister when I first arrived in Hawaii. Anyways, in our culture, my culture and Angela's culture, we come from a clan system, and the clan goes through the mother's side. So when my father, who's Angela's mother's brother, married my mom, who's in this picture right here with the shaka, he had to move to live with my mom on my mother's island because my mom, as a woman in her society, hold the land and the food for her children. So this is why my father had to leave his island to join my mom. And that happens to many men that married out of the islands. They move to their wife's island so that they can be, with their family and raise a family there. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to share my slide, move on to the next slide, but I'm not seem to be able to do that. Oh, there you go. So like Jake mentioned, I went to Xavier High School, but I wanted to highlight my educational journey. That my whole goal to gain my education and um, gosh, I cannot even talk anymore. My major in college was all determined by my family and my culture and my community. Growing up on a small island like that or a small atoll is very remote. There's no doctors, there's no hospitals. And I witnessed my grandparents and people getting sick where our medicines were no longer working, our traditional medicines. And I really wanted to go off to learn to be able to come back and help our people. And everyone felt that that was what's important for our community, and they were all supportive of me going off. Um, I also want to share that my parents didn't work for money. I also grew up in on an island that we don't live off money, but we live off the land. So everyone on the island supported my education. Xavier High School in this picture here. I'm actually posing with my brothers from Kiribati. Um, but this high school here, it's a Jesuit school, and you pay for your tuition. It's a private school. I didn't have the money, so my families all contributed. My paternal uncle, my maternal cousin and uncles, and including the priest on the island. And that's how I made it. Just want to give you a closer look of, I come from Micronesia, from Chuk, and Micronesia is actually made up of 7 um, nations or territories. Some of these nations are affiliated with, I think, closely affiliated with the South Pacific. Um, they were colonies of Britain and I think New Zealand or Australia. I know Nauru is it's closely affiliated with Australia, but the rest of us are with the United States. I know when I read the topic of this, the things that stood out to me, it's colonization, decolonizing, uh, uh, indigenizing. And so I want to share my talk from that perspective. If you take a closer look, I just want to take you really closer to our islands. The Micronesia really, this is just the Federated States of Micronesia. It spreads out. There's so many islands. I like how Vili was, sharing about Niue and about those pictures. I think in order for us to truly understand and to truly understand the health of Pacific Islanders, identity is very, very important, and I'm going to talk about that um, in the later slide. But identity is very important, and for us, for me, as a Chukis woman, I didn't learn I was Chukis until I went to Xavier High School, because Chuk literally means mountain. I do not have mountain on my island, and you guys can see it from the slide, and it really matters. Those things matter to us when we move abroad and here in diaspora. The way we are being represented, it's not truthful to our truth, to our own story. So that's why I really want to tell this story from my own perspective, from my own story, so that people can understand what does health really means. And yeah, and so in these 4 states of Micronesia, there's 4 main islands, and that's the only islands that have electricity, running water, uh, airport, high school. To further your education, you have to leave the islands to go and further your education. And I think a lot of us Pacific Islanders experience that. And so the changes in our families started when education was introduced, where our older siblings had to leave to go off to college. And I love how Philly also talks a lot about the sister-brother relationship, because I believe in that, and I also am going to talk to that. We had our share of colonial powers that had shaped who we are today. I have Japanese uncles. We have very close relationship with the priests and the missionaries that came to Micronesia. Even relationship between, you know, Samoa, Hawaii, where the missionaries came in from Hawaii, and during the German time, the Samoans, or maybe from Western Samoa, were in Chuk and were all over the Pacific, just working with the Germans. And those exchanges happened way early on, even before, you know, the comeback of free association. Um, and but one thing that I know I have only 10 minutes, I want to spend time on this part, and that is our Micronesian values. Um, what does it mean to be a Chugis woman, or what does that mean to me as a woman who holds the family? Because I generate the clan. Um, our number one value in Micronesia is relationship. And if you look closely at relationship, it is the core of our health. It is believed that when one person is sick within the family, that it is a cause of a damage in the relationship in the family. You know, with all of this introduced um communicable diseases, it's really difficult to work with us, because, or with our folks, because it's hard for them to see that eating delicious food can make you sick, can make your blood pressure go up, can make your um, you know, cholesterol level go up, because our culture is a culture of food and culture of, you know, like food is healthy for us. But when our diet changed, that also changed with that. So that's why I see that colonialism and our health relationship, they're very interconnected. Um, I'm looking at my time. So I want to spend time to focus um, on the recent event that happened here in Honolulu with the 16 years old that was shot by the police. Um, a lot of people have reached out and wonder what we can do about that. But in my looking at that situation and the situation about relationship, um, I, you know, when you do not have a good relationship, you do not have a good, uh, then you do not see the human relationship. And I just feel like for these kids to do um, those things that they did prior to the teen getting shot, um, that's not Micronesian culture. That's not my Chugis culture. Um, but there has to be something wrong. And the more I look closely at that, in and reflecting on my own experience too, I know when we grow up back home, everyone, we know each other and we're all interrelated. Here in Hawaii, we are related. We are related to people that are nice to us, and those will be considered our friends. But when these kids are faced with discrimination, I think, and being lost of not knowing their culture anymore and where they come from, um, that's where I feel like this behavior may have stemmed from. So to really end this, when I tried to understand what is decolonization, what does um, indigenizing mean to me, and one word come to me, and that is the word of my uncle in teaching, and it's the word that is equivalent to those terms because we don't, you know, have those terms in our culture, but it's the word called matauhefel. And matauhefel is really to be able to, and this is a term that navigators use when they go out or they journey out into the ocean, and before they can no longer see land, they have to turn around to see where they originate from, where they came from, in order for them to be able to reach their destination and be able to come back home. Um, within relationship, it is so important that we understand the relationships within, because then it can also guide us to our role in the family, and our responsibility in the family, and um, I think that's one area that our children really needs. And so I know I'm like going off and off, but um, my term for today is really the word matahefel, and I think it encompasses everything that we try to talk about today, to be able to, as Pacific Islanders in diaspora, as we try to decolonize. It will be hard to decolonize if we don't know where we originate from. And when in looking at that, I also felt that decolonization will have different, um, you know, start point with each different individual. Um, and I think for academia, it is so valued to hear this perspective of Indigenous people, because they can really enrich, the body of knowledge that we're trying to teach future leaders, future, people that will take care of our community. And I thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Josie. Fascinating presentation. Thank you again. There is so much to be said about the need to disaggregate data in order to acknowledge the distinctions and disparities between Pacific Islanders and Asian populations. That's always a topic that's being discussed. Thank you for elevating the need to acknowledge the unique characteristics that exist between and among our own oceanic, our own islander societies and identities. That same focus also needs to be upheld there. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Geez, there's just so many questions and so many things, so many directions we can go with this, having this rock star panel that we have right in front of us today. But with the time is short, so I'm going to put out a couple of mine that I've got, and then we'll jump into the chat and see what others have been asking as well. I just wanted to ask kind of a general question, and anyone who feels compelled to answer first, go ahead and just jump in. But Pacific Islanders, that live in the diaspora often have, well, I would say there are differences in definition of health, as you've all touched on. Definitely, people define health differently. People ascribe different causes to different health conditions. People believe that there are different remedies for different health conditions, etc. And in many times those are oppositional or don't align well with the Western clinical definitions and clinical guidelines, right? Do any of you have any suggestions for ways that we can, as public health officials, as students, as clinical medicine practitioners, how can we reconcile these opposing definitions of health when we're working in a Western clinical system, but with folks who have definitions of health and worldviews that just don't align?
Okay, I guess I can speak to that. I work a lot with, that type of situation. And I think one thing that we have to remember is that there are multiple perspectives, and I always consider them lenses. So you put on a lens when you work with certain situation, right? So one thing that I fail to address is, and I know it's true for all of us, most of us Pacific Islanders, is that for us, relationship does not just end with human people, but we have relationship with land, we have relationship with the ocean, we have relationship with objects in our land, and most importantly, we have relationship with spirit. We believe that our ancestors, our people, when they die, our folks, they become spirit and they become our, and they still stay with us. And I think that's what modern medicine or Western medicine lacks, is the spiritual aspect of things. And I've always, when I give advice to medical professionals, I always tell them it won't hurt to honor their culture. Ask them what do they believe in this type of procedures, and listen to that, acknowledge that, and then you also explain to them what it will take in the Western perspective on how to work with this. And then that way, I think respect is the main important thing. And respect comes with acknowledgement of who you are.
I love that. Thank you for that, for sure. Juliann or Vili, anything you'd like to add, or any other suggestions in navigating this space of conflicting health definitions?
I was going to mention, it was a good question you asked, Jake. I was going to mention something about traditional healing. I know we have that here in New Zealand quite a bit in terms of these practices that we do have. And for many of my colleagues, especially amongst our Pacific doctors, you know, they say to me, it's, if you use traditional healing, that's fine. You know, you can use those sort of things for ailments, for little things. But one of my colleagues said to me, if it's like a broken arm, if it's like cancer, those sort of things, you sort of can't use your traditional for massages in terms of, you know, curing those particular illnesses. But it's having that balance between the Western and our traditional healing. And we have that, you know, I'm all for it in terms of our traditional medicine and our practices, but there's some things that we need to use our Western medicine for in terms of, you know, particular illnesses or particular ailments, because if you have a broken arm, as I said, you can't fall that back in your arm, go back to its normal place. You need to go and see the doctors, you need to get a cast to get it fixed, or you need to have some sort of cure for it in terms of what we can offer. So I think for many of the colleagues here in New Zealand, you know, those traditional practices will always be ongoing. It always happened. And also in the Pacific region, because I know many of our Pacific people in New Zealand, they often go back to the region as well for certain ailments, for certain things that they do have, especially around the child and babies in terms of massages that they do have. So they often go back to those particular countries. And I can only give the example of Niue. One of my nieces went back for a particular massage for her baby, and it's called a hengi. And you can only get that going back home up in Niue. And we have a lot of our traditional healers and massagers who do those type of practice. But it's in New Zealand, it's slowly dying out. You know, we don't have a lot of those practices. A lot of these families are not continuing because, you know, a lot of them are passing away and not giving that knowledge in terms of passing it down, because traditional healing practice, my understanding, it's based on your families. You know, those things are passed down from generation to generation. So often in New Zealand, it can, you know, it doesn't maintain in terms of practicing. So I know I'm all for traditional practices, but we have to realize that, you know, there is a means and ways of actually working with the Western medicine. And I'm, you know, I'm a great supporter of that, because I came through the traditional massages and medicine with my own parents in terms of their practices. But often you know, you're in New Zealand, you have to go to the doctor. So that's probably my only comment, Jake.
Yeah, thank you, Vili and Josie. And I think just to add on to that, I think, you know, sort of taking a step back and thinking about how our cultures embrace both. I mean, we embrace both Western medicine and, you know, our fofos and our tablaceas and our herbal healings. And I think it's not the other way around, right? So it's the US context is always either or, right? It's either you agree with Western medicine or you don't. So I think, you know, as a community, we also have to understand those structural and systemic dynamics in thinking about illness and thinking about disability. And I agree with Vili. I mean, I come from a family of Western medicine people who, you know, we have these debates because I often sometimes think that you know, we have to meet our needs in our terms, right? And, you know, in Samoa, they always say it's a balance. It's finding balance and harmony between spiritual, non-living, the living, and etc. So, I mean, I think we have so many things here that we can always nod to and practice. And I don't think we have to accept this kind of either or thinking, line of thinking in Western medicine and Western culture. We can say and or all of the above, you know, like our extended families and our foods and everything else, all of the above, you know. So, you know, I think that's just something we have to keep negotiating, but I'll stop there.
Yes, I love that. And I appreciate the pushback on the dichotomy, because for so many years in Western medicine, all these other things like herbal healing or massage therapy or acupuncture have been called alternative alternative therapy, meaning it's one or the other, right? That it's an alternative rather than complementary medicine or supplementary, or we need to change the terminology around those things when we talk about those things. And so we can start normalizing that too. So thank you very, very much. We've got students, prospective researchers, future academicians, practitioners tuning in today. And I thought maybe we could throw somebody a bone or an idea for a project or research to implement a PhD dissertation topic later on, who knows. But what I wanted to ask each of you, what do you think are the biggest gaps in the literature, or biggest gaps in the knowledge base in the areas that you're dealing with right now? Like, where do you feel more work is needed, or where researchers and advocates should be paying more attention in your specific field? Josie, can you think of a gap or an area that you would like to see more work being done in?
Definitely, I would say health. I mean, just understanding. Philly kind of mentioned about, I think there's a lack of understanding of, even the whole childbearing, like prenatal and postnatal. And here, running a lot into women running into CPS or child welfare service because they have missed their appointment. But also being in school and trying to do research, and you find lack of literature from our own Pacific Islands. I think there's such a need for that. There's such a need for research in that area. Like what I talk about relationship and um, uh, about that system or that way of thinking. There hasn't been any study on it, so I can only argue that from my own personal experience and knowledge. But I think there's such a need for our own Pacific Islanders to study and to contribute to the literature that people are using for their research or for their papers.
Agreed. Vili, how about in the space of substance use or addiction? Any specific area that you feel you would love to see more knowledge base developed?
I think for me, I'm not being overly biased. It's probably looking in the space of Pacific men's health, but also looking at the drug use, especially around P and all these Palangi drugs that we've never used before. So those will be probably my key areas of interest and priority is men's health and the high use of these new drugs that are coming out, and also vaping. It seems to be quite an interesting area of research in terms of the addiction space. And for us here in New Zealand, we don't have a lot of people doing specific addictions research. So it's quite limited in what we do here. And again, highlighting funding is always going to be a big problem. We don't have a lot of funds to do anything, because the priority areas has always been diabetes, obesity. There's always seemed to be the common elements and the common areas that we're funding is, but it's probably the high use or high end addictions drugs that we do. So that's probably my wish list, Jake.
Awesome. And I hope the students and prospective researchers out there are taking notes as well. Juliann, how about in gender studies or activism or advocacy around disability, et cetera? Any points of interest that you wish you'd like to see more people get engaged in?
Yes, no, thank you for that question. I mean, I think number one is sort of the intangible, right? Is our attitudes towards these issues. So I think we have to kind of move away from this stigma and shame when we talk about mental health, when we talk about disability, when we talk about, just in Samoa alone, this Jake with the words that we use, words like ulukae, broken head, aivalea, someone who is, quote unquote stupid, and so I think language and attitudes, I think is a starting point. I mean, there's so much work to do, I think, in thinking about how bodies and ways that we use language also affects, our own health, emotional and mental health. So, I think those are some things I would advocate for.
Awesome. Thank you all. We've got a question here in the queue. The first one here is for Dr. Vili Nosa. How does Pacific Islander health in Aotearoa compare with health in the islands themselves? Is Islander health worse in Aotearoa versus the home islands? Or is it that whites have privileged health? That's the question that's there in the box there.
I mean, that's an interesting question too, Jake, because in the Pacific region, it's very hard to get some good, robust or decent data. And even if you do get data, some of the data can be quite outdated. So for example, we have the WHO STEP survey, and those can be, they're a couple of years old, they're not recent. But in answering that question, many of the major health issues in the Pacific region or in some of the countries, they're sent to New Zealand. So if it's a real complicated health issue that you can't deal with the resources that you have in the hospitals, or the medical profession is not able to actually help you, they're sent to New Zealand in terms of those health. It's mainly around accidents, car accidents, mental health issues, counseling. Some of those mental health issues are not available in some of the Pacific countries. Psychiatrists are not easily available in many of those Pacific countries as well. So income, that's a good question. And to be honest, it's a good research question if you're actually comparing, contrasting the health profile of a particular country or the region in comparison to New Zealand. And obviously New Zealand's, we've got a lot of stats, we've got a lot of research that's done in terms of a lot of these health issues. And those research are quite ethnic Pacific too. So that, I'm not sure if it's a straightforward, it's an easy question to answer. But again, in highlighting the last point, is it whites that have privilege? Of course they do, because they've got high incomes, better access to services. Pacific people live in low socioeconomic areas, housing is quite poor, employment is quite low, income is low, education is quite low. So we're up against it anyway in terms of the health profile, because obviously if you don't have a high income, you don't have a secure job, you don't have access to going to the doctors, and it's pretty expensive going to the doctors here in New Zealand. So obviously, if you're sick, you tend not to, it's not a priority. Health is not a priority here in New Zealand. It's probably ranked in the 3rd, 4th category, but it's the day-to-day living. So yeah, it's a nice question. It's not a straightforward question. I hope I've given you some insights and highlight in terms of my own experiences. Yeah, the health profile in New Zealand is getting worse. It's not getting any better, but also highlighting it's moving to Australia as well. A lot of our Pacific people going over there, so the health profile is getting worse too. So I hope that gives you a bit of an insight.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you very much for the insight. Another question here we have from Edmund Fehoko. First of all, thanking the amazing presentations. And this question also references a comment from Katarina Tewa yesterday regarding simultaneously grounding our work or health research and articulating interconnections across cultures, geography, etc. So the question is, how do we navigate the ethics of practice in ways that capture specificity in our culture, languages, boundaries, without dishonoring each other? And so, yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I think that also speaks to the sense of a solidarity, right, that we show as, if we're a Polynesian sitting at a policy table, how do we respectfully acknowledge the other groups that may not be at that table in respectful ways without prioritizing or competing priorities? That's my editorial on top of that. But the question itself was, what are some ways that we, in practice, that we can address that dynamic? Good question, Edmund. You've got our panel stumped for just for a second, eh?
I will take a try at that.
Go ahead, Josie.
Because in our work, Jake, like in our the APIHF work where we come together to advocate for policies, and also here in Hawaii, even that recent incident with the youth, there's always that stop and say, wait, hold on, who's making the call? And in my work with the NAPI, Native Hawaiian Pacific Island population or group 3R team with COVID, I think COVID really gave us a good opportunity to practice this, because we constantly talk among each other. And so for me, and this is very honest, true talk, Micronesia, like in Pacific, there's Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. Melanesia, I feel like they're kind of like, but I think Micronesia and Polynesia, because it's micro and poly, there is really that, and also like the smallness of the population. And when we look at the way policies are driven, it's by data, and you look at all of that, and we always come out small, right? All the times in numbers. And so it really frustrates me during COVID, because during COVID, it was our population that got really hit hard. But we're all lumped in as PI, right? And when we go from state to state, that number varies on what PI community is truly impacted. And so to get the help during COVID, and also to get the help during this recovery for vaccine, that is, it really matters to know. So I always preach, let's collaborate through diversity, meaning let us respect each other's culture, respect each other's story, respect each other's truth or fact. Everyone has a truth, and I think yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but that's I just want to throw that out, because it comes back to the word respect. And thank goodness we Pacific Islanders have that shared value, respecting each other's culture, how you do things in your culture. With the 16 years old, people are pressuring us, what are you doing? What are you doing? But I'm looking at it, because he's Chugis, I'm looking at it from a Chugis perspective. In our culture, it's a family matter. So I'm taking my lead from the family. What does the family wish for this? But the community also has a responsibility where we can bring food, we can bring money. So that will be, so that's how we look at things. So I think in understanding the relationship and whose responsibilities and roles are this, I think it goes back to what I was trying to say. I probably just didn't know how to say it right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Josie. I really love that emphasis on respect. And I think this question is also something that speaks to, stereotypes, right? And hegemony in the Pacific. So let's just name that up front, right? That in the Pacific, we have, just like Josie's mentioned, we have communities in Polynesia or other parts of the Pacific that are always highlighted as the Pacific, right? So, we have to name that. And I think as a community, the collaborative part is really important, but we also have to recognize the deficits and the kind of violence that comes with those actions, whether it's inherent or inadvertent, whatever it is. We have to be cognizant of those things and offer space when you get opportunities to others. So, I kind of go back to, the way I was brought up. You open doors for others, and you help and support, kind of like solidarity politics that you're also talking about, Jake. So, and this is not something that is individual, right? So I just want to highlight that this is a collective effort on all our parts. The individualism within U.S. Western culture is very much implicated in this, and it's that way for a very particular reason, and it's not to serve our communities, right? So I think we also have to kind of think about the power relations in those conversations and who's benefiting from it. So I think that's just kind of another way to reflect that back.
Thank you so much. I've got a question here from Melsina Folau, who's one of our Micronesian community leaders here in Utah, thanking Josie and all the panelists. But in regards to the brother-sister relationship, Melsina says that in Pohnpei, they also have that same dynamic there. The question is, how do we apply that brother-sister relationship in a Eurocentric medical environment, one that seems to require quantitative and empirical data? She hopes that question makes sense, but the way that I see that, what you're asking, Melsina, hopefully I'm getting it right as well, is how do we encourage that dynamic, that communication dynamic between brother and sister relationship within the healthcare setting, even when it's not one that's necessarily widespread or practiced in the clinical setting?
I think in answering that question, Jake, I think it's as I said, it's a work in progress. It's something that we have in our own traditional cultures and with our own communities, but it's something that we need to sort of look at it and seriously look at it in a way that we can use these sort of relationships in formalizing and as a form of practices that's going to help us improve our health profile. Because time and time again, we've used as Western health promotion models that doesn't seem to be working for us. I mean, that's from my own personal view, but having to go back at our traditional practices, our culture, and using that as our form of leadership, as a form of moving forward. You know, we've tried all these things. So let's have a look at this relationship, the brother and sister. Let's try and formulate it within our different cultures. And I know there's going to be differences in there, but the common element here is that the brother and sister is you know, it's common throughout these specific cultures, but it's just dissecting and looking at which elements can be used or should be used and using it as our, you know, as a different avenue. I'm not saying it's the be all and end all and it's one avenue, but it just gives you these sort of options in terms of looking at what can we do. You know, our profile is getting worse. Our profile is not getting any better. Let's just look at what we can do. So that's probably my comment. And it's something that we need to sort of engage, dialogue, relook at it. And you could look at it from a different perspective. Look at it from your own culture, because there are differences, there are similarities. So there are going to be different issues. And it's not a one shoe is going to fit all for the Pacific culture. It's, you know, it's just dissecting it in terms of the differences. So that's probably my comment that I'd like to make.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Adam,
go ahead. Sorry. Yep.
So we practice that in my culture. It's very, very strong. And it's also like brother and sister. There are behaviors that come with that. And I think for that particular question, you know, the role of the brother to the sister, like Vili explained, to protect, part of that too is, you know, when I talk about Micronesia being a clan system and that you belong to the sister's clan. So the brother, literally, in a sense, if you look at it from the Western perspective, he's the father of the children, of his sister's children. So because they take on his role, like my son will take on my brother's role, not my husband's role, because he belongs to my clan. And my son will take care of the health, well-being of my clan, not his father's clan, because his cousins, the sons of the sisters of my husband will be responsible for that. So I think we can really use, you know, that in terms of when it comes to health, you know, anything that has to do with childbearing, that kind of things, the brother and sisters don't mix. You know, the brother, when the sister is pregnant, he brings coconut juice, he brings fish. His biggest catch is for the sister. The biggest taro that he planted is for the sister. They come and they feed the sister so that the baby can have milk. They help the father, you know, do that, and it's their responsibility. It's a really beautiful relationship, and I really love the fact that Philip brought this up. I didn't realize there was somebody else who's doing this work out there, because I was like, is anybody doing this work? I mean, I came from a culture like that where I bow for my brothers. Like when they're sitting, I'm on the floor. And people are like, wait, what's going on? But it's really the respecting, and you have to understand beyond that. And I think it's what keeps the family together. Yeah, so like in violence, right? When the brothers are fighting, the sister they show up, they don't even say anything, but just their appearance, the brother will stop. Or the sister can go out and fight a woman who disrespect the brother, vice versa. And yeah, I'll stop here because I can go on and on.
So fascinating, and I really do want to go on and on. I think our timekeeper will get on me for that, but in keeping with the program, and I'm so sorry because we do have other questions that are lined up here as well, and we hope to be able to post them to our panelists and be able to share them, and our host organization can hopefully in the wrap up kind of give some more information on how we can do that. But I just wanted to ask as a kind of a wrap up question. The reality is that health work in its broadest definition is not easy, and dismal health disparities, as Vili, as all of you have mentioned in many different segments of this work, can be demoralizing. They're not happy statistics in a lot of cases. Can you please share with all of us an Indigenous reference, something that you derive from ancestry or culture or upbringing, from language, that helps to keep you grounded in the work and keeps you energized, and gives you the motivation to continue in this work? If there's something, a proverb or a story or something you can share, I would really love for you to share. Juliann, want to take a stab at that?
Yes. Thank you. I love that. So I think for me, I grew up with, my father was the Sao of Aringa, so he's sort of we called him the king bee of our family clan, right? So he was sort of the chief of our family clan. And so, I think, my work now is thinking about tautua, is thinking about service to the family, to the village, to the extended family, to your own immediate family, but also to the church. And so, for me, I think, I feel like I've lived tautua, but didn't really know that was the kind of term for it. I mean, I am still thinking about when I was little, having all sorts of people at the house. And I remember telling my friends at school, yeah, my house is like Grand Central Station. Like there's so many people there. There's people in and out, there's always things happening. There's always a CE or a favelave or something. Somebody's always bringing food and etc. So, I think for me, tautua is kind of something that I felt like I've lived, but now I'm kind of theorizing. So it's kind of weird. In a lot of ways to theorize tautua, because I think we're so used to thinking about these cultural terms as static, and they're not. So I think that's the other challenge, right? Culture and tradition, etc., is always evolving. So these are just some basics here, and so I think for me, tautua is kind of encapsulate that in the kind of work that I do, professionally, but also just family-wise, like, taking my mom to the grocery store, or taking, auntie so-and-so to the doctor's appointment, or whatever it is. And I think that kind of relation and interconnectedness and service, it really is a form, to me, it also form of alofa, or love, right? Which I think kind of encapsulate what, Vili, you're also talking about, the brother and sister relations, as well as Josie, within their own communities. And I think in Samoa, it's the family, right? That's the brother and sister relations of, taking care of each other. So so I think for me, I would have to say tautua.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being with us here on the panel today. Vili, how about yourself? An Indigenous reference you can share?
I think, a lot of these questions have always been difficult and asked, but I think for me, it's having the heart and the passion to, just like Juliann, serving our people. We do this, we do this work, we do this job is to help our people. And that's probably for me, it's just, we're here for a purpose, we're serving, for many of my Pacific students, I always have a heart for them, I always take them on board, always look after them, and providing that guidance that, they're here for a reason, they're here for good education so they can help their families. So it's probably, just service, respect, and having the heart and passion. That's probably what keeps me going day in and day out. And to be honest, I'm sick and tired of looking at our people. I know you said it's grim, the statistics of being poor for health. I want to make a change. I want to make an influence. I'm tired of looking at our people getting sick, looking at them how rates of diabetes, it's negative. I want to switch that around. I want to turn it around. I want to make a good use of my time and also the role that I have in terms of serving our Pacific community. So that's probably for me, Jake. Sorry to ramble on.
It's all good. Thank you so much. And you, Josie?
I think along the same line with Juliann and Vili, what I really learned in my upbringing was that our culture was very beautiful, and that I didn't realize we were a small island until I left the island, because we always see, like it seems like we were always we were poor. Even though I didn't have money, that wasn't anything that was stopping me. But the values that was really to me, was my grandmother always reminded me to be kind and to treat others the way I want to be treated. And she would go on, like, the wind changed directions, and next time it will you might get washed up on somebody's shore. Right now, somebody else is washed up on your shore. You take good care of them. And my father, he was very rascal, and I think he's the one who really kind of like pushed me out of the island. Was he told me, I gave you up to education. Like that was his, I gave you up to education. Now you can go, and I give you up for the people so that you can serve the community. Community is so big in our culture that you can stop anything, any personal agenda, if the community needs you. So I think I have been given the permission from my parents, and even though I'm a woman in this position, it doesn't matter. My parents gave me that permission to be, to do and to serve the community, and I'm just very honored with that. Thank you.
Thank you all. This has been such a powerful, dynamic, informative experience. It's been an honor for me to be able to facilitate this panel. I'm here as a student, and on behalf of the entire audience and the University of Utah Pacific Islands Studies Initiative, thank you so much. Fa'afetaite lelava, Dr. Anesi, kiniso chapur, Josie, fakauelahi, Dr. Nosa. This has been an amazing experience. Thank you for your contribution to the overall symposium and for saving the best for last, right? This is the last session. I will, with that, our gratitude from the heart, I'll go ahead and turn it back to Maile to go ahead and conclude our session. Again, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jake, and to all of our panelists. A few more thank yous to share before we go. Thank you to all of our planning committee and event support, including Angela Robinson, Ane Tiolu, Tanji Vei, Makayo Kimbra, and Hokuai Kao. And thank you to Dean Catherine Stockton for her support, as well as our funders, the Mellon Foundation and the University of Utah's Global Learning Across the Disciplines grant from the Office of Global Engagement. A recording of this panel and the others in our series will be posted on our YouTube page. And before you go, there are also a couple other events and opportunities I wanted to share with you. So we have 2 other Pacific Island Studies programs under the leadership of Dr. Kehaulani Vaughn and the work of Moana Uluave Hafoka to make sure that you know about. The first is the Pacifica webinar series, which is archived on our YouTube page. And their next event, which will also be hosted on Zoom, is Friday, April 23rd at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. It'll be a talk by Dr. Tina Delisle from the University of Minnesota. And you can find more on that series and that upcoming talk on our Facebook and Instagram pages. The second program that they run is the Pacifica Scholars Institute. And this program is for any of you who are or who know Pacific Islander graduating seniors or transfer students interested in attending the University of Utah. This is a 5-day intensive program aimed at preparing students interested in Pacific Island studies and higher education, culture, and community-based leadership and learning. This year, it'll be held entirely online, and it'll be on June 7th to 11th. And applications for that are due on May 28th. And the link to that is in the chat. And finally, for any Pacific Islander artists in Utah, please check out the Harvard Oceanic Collections Engagement Fellowship, which is a really cool opportunity offering funding for Pacific Islanders artists who live in Utah to work with the Harvard Peabody Museum's Oceanic Collections. So yeah, that's all the announcements to share. I'll say again, thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience. And yes, have a great weekend.